Hello, welcome back at Conservatorium Maastricht, where we're having our first day of Master Research presentations at the Jazz Department. We've just come back from our short recess after the first presentation. Now we'll go into the second presentation by Sebastian Opgen-Rhein. After the presentation, we will come back here for the Q&A. Thank you.
The relationship between repetition and variation is one of the main factors that make music music. The interrelationship can define and differentiate musical genres. Popular music, for instance, is among the genres of music that is constructed and defined by repetition. However, while not being as elaborate as in genres that are built on a foundation of relative variation, such as jazz, variation in pop music still has its place, often in the form of micro-variations. Hello, my name is Sebastian Opgen-Rhein, also known as Sebastian Prince as an artist name, and in this exploratory analysis and application of micro-variations in the melody line within popular music, I am aiming to meticulously magnify micro-variations. Or in other words, I am very precisely zooming in to the minute changes in the melody line within pop music pieces.
So, let us focus our microscope on what exactly microvariations are. While the term might have occurred in different settings before, I choose to modestly redefine it, situated within a theoretical framework, and came up with a unique methodology, all of which are of my original thought. Microvariations are defined by their proclivity to be petite. While variations can be conceptualized as changes that occur over multiple bars and phrases of a section, microvariations refer to minute changes within one single repeated phrase, which mostly stays identical to the original form.
An example of microvariation, and the one that sparked the idea behind this thesis, occurs in the B sections of the song Vampire by Olivia Rodrigo. Take note of this. But you made the worst one look fine, I should have known it was strange. Microvariates too. But you made the worst one look fine, I should have known it was strange. In the last iteration of the B section. So how do we go about analyzing such a phenomenon? We start by seeing what has already been said about it and by asking our own questions, of course.
How have prominent musicologists and music theorists viewed and categorized repetition in music? How does repetition interact with other musical parameters? As mentioned before, repetition plays a key role in popular music. It has been analyzed and categorized by several musicologists and music theorists throughout the 20th and 21st century. Throughout my literature review, I read and reviewed the theories on repetition from Richard Middleton, Jonathan Kramer, David Ledoff, Gilles Deleuze, and Anne Danielsen, with a special emphasis on Middleton. What I share today is a short and select summary of it. If you have more questions, I encourage you to refer to my thesis. In his article Play It Again, Sam from 1983, Richard Middleton aims to locate repetition within an overall theory of musical syntax. To achieve that, he places different forms of repetition within several dualisms or within spectrums ranging between two poles. The first spectrum is the one indicating structural types ranging from the monad to the infinite set. With monad, he refers to the silence or unchanging sound, while he refers to the linear or non-repeating with the term infinite set. Within the spectrum, he creates more labels to categorize different syntactical structures. Repetition is referring to repetition of the same unit. Here there is a singular unit that is repeated without other options to alternate with. When one alternates between two different units, he refers to that as binary switching. You operate on a simple either-or choice. If you can switch between more than two options which vary discretely, he defines it as digital selection. When these multiple sets vary continuously, then he calls them an analog selection, where one can select from a wider set of variations than the former. Finally, he states that a composition is made out of the varying syntactical changes across layers which fall within different places on the spectrum. Beyond the syntactical spectrum, Middleton also cites textural dialectics which compare the texture of a composition at the microstructural and macrostructural levels. With microstructural level, he refers to the transition from moment to moment. It describes occurrences of momentary nature, that which happen within a short fraction of time. By the macrostructural level, Middleton refers to the structural orbit of the whole song. In other words, it describes occurrences that happen with respect to the general structure of a song and its constituent parts. While Middleton pays attention to syntax and layer, in his article The Time of Music, Jonathan Kramer delves into the chronological nature of variation. Within his research, Kramer states that all music simultaneously exhibits two opposing attributes, namely linearity and nonlinearity. With musical linearity, he defines events within a piece that occur through a teleological process, meaning that they are connected to preceding and/or succeeding events. Nonlinear is defined by the fact that events within or characteristics of a musical piece are determined by the nature of the entire piece or section, or the ideas that define them. To simplify, the characteristics of the music arise from the nature of the whole piece rather than the portion played prior to it. Kramer categorizes music through variations and combinations of these two modes.
What these summarized theories have in common is that they identify repetition as a fundamental within the musical syntax. However, they often fail to recognize that repetition is not a standalone. Anne Danielsen, in her article Time and Time Again from 2018, argues that both the interaction of what is repeated with the variation and other musical parameters, as well as the social, cultural, or historical context of how and where it appears, determine its final effect. While we have been speaking of music theory, let us now turn our attention to the practicalities. What effect could repetition have on the audience?
Just as much as the audience, along with their social, cultural, or historical context, has influence on repetition, repetition in music has dynamically determined effects on the audience, ranging from inviting audience participation to directing the listener's attention to contrast. These effects are regulated by repetition's stimulation of our sense of pleasure and listener's resolution. Listener's resolution is a term coined by Anne Danielsen in 2018. By resolution, she refers to the extent to which a listener can perceive and process variation in the repetitive. Someone with a high resolution is capable of detecting minor changes within what is repeated, while a listener with low resolution will perceive what is repeated with minor changes as virtually identical. Regarding pleasure, Middleton states that different types of repetition resonate with the various part of the psyche, that is the mind, to result in a sense of pleasure, all Freudian concepts. He further states that pleasure can be bifurcated as plaisir and jouissance. Plaisir refers to pleasure that stems from following rules and structural elements, while jouissance emanates from breaking such conventions. While there is much debate about whether the dichotomy of pleasure sits well with the repetition-variation spectrum, it is very clear that repetition and variation indeed stimulate pleasure in individuals. Repetition facilitates information processing by directing the listener's attention to the contrasting or non-contrasting components of a musical piece to generate pleasure in the psyche. The role of surprise and pleasure can be seen in real-life experiments. When directly comparing repetitive with non-repetitive parts, listeners tend to rate the latter as more prominent. When aiming to achieve good balance between the repetitive and non-repetitive, Krenbühl and Kuhns state that such balance is best achieved through the use of the AABX pattern. The A part is repeated twice and is followed by a B part which is of similar length and tune. The AAB sequence is the shortest arrangement of parts that lead to the establishing of a pattern followed by its immediate violation. All in all, we can see how repetition, together with its relationship to variation, is a powerful tool to use when optimizing a piece towards the aim to create maximum pleasure and information processing in the listener.
While the previous information applied to all music in general, this thesis seeks to explore the genre of popular music in specific. Hence, it will concentrate on the socio-cultural context of popular music with regard to repetition and variation.
Popular music has its origins in Afro-American music, which is defined by its repetitiveness. Popular music composers often make use of chord loops typically consisting of 2 to 4 chords, which participate in the stratification between pitch-based aspects of music and the harmonic domain. Apart from the repetitiveness in the harmonic and melodic syntaxes, the metric organization of pop and rock songs is typically quite repetitive as well. Clerk and Helmuth state that in popular music, repetitiveness tends to drive attention to the varied within the repetition, as in other genres of music. Middleton states that repetition in pop music creates a more intimate connection between the audience and the music by enabling inclusion. Through these observations, it is very clear that repetition, its categorization, and effects can clearly be observed and applied within the context of popular music.
In previous sections, we delved into the realm of repetition. However, the other side of the coin, that is variation, remains unaddressed. Does variation also have categorizations developed by earlier musicologists or music theorists, as seen with repetition? Could it be seen as an inherently unrelated phenomenon to repetition? Let's flip the coin.
Variation is a universal principle that underlies all music. Furthermore, a pattern that contains the unexpected is a requirement for aesthetic enjoyment. Kramer attests that due to humankind's short-term memory, we have an innate tendency to focus on what varies by relegating what is repeated to the background. Thus, one can see how variation and repetition cannot be analyzed independently given their interdependence. This is reflected in Middleton's spectrum of musical syntax. Generally, musicologists have admitted that a precise definition or categorization of micro-variation has not been achieved and that the discourse of musicologists in regard to the variation principle is mainly based on limited examples. Musicologists do acknowledge that the variation principle is universal within music. Still, there exists no overall theory on variation and its multitude of different occurrences.
This leads me to the question, what kind of effect would variation have on the listener?
Meyer states that when the listener detects variation, it breaks their expectation and arouses emotions. Such responses might result from the occurrence of involuntary attention the listener could experience through the element of surprise in the form of variation. Surprise is elicited by events that deviate from any previously constructed schema within the mind. It is assumed to divert ongoing processes in the direction of the stimulus causing the surprise. When music introduces surprise through variation, it becomes less predictable. When taking the predictability to its lower limits, meaning to near unpredictability, it will bring the listener closer to jouissance. Thus, surprise can result in pleasure and can thus increase a piece's chance to gain popularity amongst listeners, possibly contributing to its commercial success.
The hypothesized link between surprise and market success is strengthened by the research paper, A Statistical Analysis of the Relationship Between Harmonic Surprise and Preference in Popular Music by Miles et al. 2017. In the article, they state that the reward center in the brain can be preferentially activated by musical pieces. Furthermore, they propose two hypotheses to explain why some musical pieces are preferred over others: the absolute surprise hypothesis and the contrastive surprise hypothesis.
The absolute surprise hypothesis states that unexpected events in music can lead directly to pleasure. Here, surprise, as it indicates new information, could possibly be valuable to the individual receiving it. A study by Salimpour shows that musical selection that evoked chills in the listener simultaneously occurred with dopamine release and often happened during unexpected events within the music. The contrastive surprise hypothesis proposes that the juxtaposition of expected events following the unexpected leads to an overall rewarding response. In other words, musical sections with relatively low surprise follow passages with moderately high surprise, going from tension to release, from foreign to familiar. The process of building tension and then releasing it is what leads to an overall preference that is driven by the element of surprise.
The results of their study are consistent with both hypotheses. While both hypotheses seem to contradict one another, Miles et al. Proved that emotional reward can stem from both adherence and/or deviation from the listener's expectations. Thus, they proposed the hybrid surprise hypothesis. Absolute and contrastive surprise are what drives preference, since both forms of surprise can be advantageous for the listeners, depending on different conditions. So, how can we classify microvariations that bring about surprise in the audience?
The theoretical framework classifies microvariation in the melody line across 5 dimensions: macro versus microstructure, strand, syntax, linearity, and purpose. Macro versus microstructure. This refers to if the microvariation occurs within the context of the macrostructure or the microstructure. The macrostructure essentially refers to the entire piece and its internal architecture. In other words, it pertains to the various sections of the given piece. The microstructure refers to each section of the piece themselves. This dimension specifies the scale at which microvariations are observed and the chronological distance between the repeated components in which the microvariation occurs. Melodic versus rhythmic versus lyrical variation and combinations. Melody, melody rhythm, and lyrics are all intertwined strands within the melody line. Each of these strands can vary autonomously or in conjunction with each other. To clearly categorize microvariations, separating them by strand provides a further layer of categorization from an implementation point of view. Monad to infinite set. Adapting the quintessential spectrum from Middleton and applying it to microvariations serves one primary purpose. It facilitates the measure of the continuity of a given microvariation by placing it on a scale from perfect continuity to complete discreteness, that is, perfect discontinuity. Linear versus nonlinear. This dichotomy, adapted von Kramer, touches upon whether the microvariation emerges from the sequential evolution of the piece or if it is of momentary nature and is produced by the interaction of different layers within the given moment. A microvariation would be categorized as linear if its existence surfaces from previous events or may allude to subsequent events which are disconnected from the microvariation. A microvariation would be categorized as nonlinear if its occurrence directly connects to phenomena that happen simultaneously or immediately prior to or after the moment of the variation in other or the same layers of the composition. Purpose. Purpose focuses on the potential end goal of the microvariation and the way it might affect the piece or the audience. This dimension aids in connecting back to the element of surprise and further discerning the various shades of involuntary attention. Labeling them through the dimension for purpose also provides tentative guidance to other researchers or composers with regard to the application of microvariation.
For the analysis, I utilized a qualitative and exploratory methodology. It is qualitative as I categorize variables and concepts qualitatively and not numerically. Furthermore, it is exploratory since this thesis sheds light on a previously understudied area of musical research. The dataset consists of 9 songs which were placed in the Billboard Hot 100 and/or the UK single charts within the last 10 years, which I transcribed and precisely analyzed.
When analyzing the compositions, I first screened both the microstructure and the macrostructure for melodic, rhythmic, or lyrical repetitions and their combinations. Once I marked out all repetitive sections and phrases which occur on both the macrostructural and the microstructural level, I went on to highlight microvariation which occurs throughout these repeated structures, organized by strand of variation, with a color code. I further categorized them by whether they occur in the context of the microstructure or the macrostructure, their nonlinearity and non-continuity, to see how they related to the rest of the composition. Furthermore, I documented the categories that emerged and summarized them at the end of the analysis section as a table for reference. Here I found several categories of purposes in which I placed each extracted microvariation. I did so to show what effect they potentially had on the respective composition and how they could be used in further compositions, which I will address later in this video. Finally, I applied some of these to my compositions. Once I identified spots where I wanted to apply microvariation, I adapted the melody line according to what purpose I wanted the microvariation to function as. The overall aim here is to improve my level of composition.
Of all the dimensions, purpose is the most distinctive and forms the cornerstone of my analysis. It is also what truly makes each microvariation unique and goes beyond a simple categorization, unlike the other dimensions. As a result, I shall shine light on this dimension, especially in my discussion section.
The purposes found throughout my analysis are the following: lyric stressing, note stressing, harmony stressing, melodic conclusive, lyrical conclusive, transitional, metaphoric, conceptual, and dynamic. While I will be unable to go through all of these microvariations in detail, I shall highlight a few for your understanding. Lyric stressing microvariation. The microvariation occurs to emphasize certain lyrics. Here, strands of the melody line, other than the lyrical strand, microvariate to stress a certain lyric or lyrics. The example that you can see here occurs in the song Dance the Night by Dua Lipa, which was released in 2023. The A section introduces the rhythmical repetition RR1 within the first bar of its first iteration. RR1 appears 6 times throughout the song. Of the 6, the 4th repetition uses a microvariation.
From "Find me under the lights, diamonds under my eyes," to "Oh, my outfit's so tight, you can see my heartbeat tonight."
While the last part of the original phrase is rhythmically altered ever so slightly, in RR1-4, the more prominent change here is that its starting point has been shifted back by a 16th note, creating a 16th note rest. While all rhythmical changes here are continuous, the sudden occurrence of the note rest clearly distinguishes RR1-4 from any other iteration of RR1. It is a small yet very impactful change. The rest occurs right after the lyric heartbeat, and its purpose might be to generally emphasize the lyric. Thus it can be interpreted as a lyric stressing microvariation. As its occurrence is connected to the lyric of the moment, it is nonlinear, and as the repetition itself occurs within one and the same section, it is to be seen within the context of the microstructure. Overall, it is a nonlinear rhythmic microvariation of analog nature that happens in the context of the microstructure for lyric stressing purposes. Melodic conclusive microvariation. The microvariation occurs to give the melody line a conclusive feel. While the change of the melodic strand is mandatory, other strands can vary alongside simultaneously. The example here occurs in the song Sweet Creature from Harry Styles, which was released in 2017. Here the microvariation occurs between the C sections, which are the choruses of the song. The complete repetition CR2 occurs twice within each of the 3 iterations of C. A complete repetition is a combination of all strands of the melodic line. While being identical in its first 5 iterations, there is a microvariation apparent in the final iteration of the complete repetition.
From "Sweet creature, sweet creature," to "Sweet creature, sweet creature."
In the end of the phrase, the melody over the lyric creature goes up instead of down, a clearly non-continuous change which falls within the area of digital selection. Occurring in the last iteration of both the C section and CR2, so CR2-6, and by the end of the song, this microvariation gives a clear conclusive feel to the section, which is why I categorize it as melodic conclusive microvariation. It is a linear melodic microvariation of the nature of digital selection which occurs in the context of the macrostructure.
One of the main aims for this research was for me to build a toolset of microvariations from which I can pick and choose for my original compositions. Here I chose to incorporate microvariations within 5 of the songs which I will perform at my master's program's final recital. After finishing up the overall idea of each composition, I analyzed their macrostructure and their microstructure to identify which type of repetition is situated where in each song. While many of these repetitions were active choices, others appeared naturally in the composition process. After analyzing a composition's repetition, I then situated moments in the composition in which I felt like microvariation could be of benefit to create an overall well-rounded composition. Finally, I decided what type of microvariation I felt fitting for each of these moments, and ultimately what purpose I wanted to convey. I then adapted each composition accordingly. I shall demonstrate 2 of them today, and the rest I hope you can hear in my master's concert.
Lyric stressing microvariation. The example here is Happy Happy Happy, one of my original songs. The highlighted instance of microvariation occurs in the melodic repetition MR1, which is situated in A1 and A3, which are verses of the song. While occurring 4 times in A1, its occurrence is limited to 2 iterations within A3, resulting in a total number of 6 repetitions of MR1. The first 5 iterations of MR1 are melodically identical. I did that so that the microvariation in MR16 is more impactful through surprise.
From I'm tired of smiling and blatantly lying to just how much energy.
While the third note, A sharp, of the original phrase is shifted upwards to a C sharp, the subsequent notes are exchanged with a small 16th run. The former note microvariates discontinuously within the area of digital selection, while on the other hand, the latter changes continuously within the area of analog selection. Though both changes serve the same nonlinear purpose of stressing the lyrics how much energy in the phrase just how much energy was put into memories. Thus, the microvariation functions as a lyric stressing microvariation. Overall, it is a nonlinear melodic microvariation whose nature is a combination of digital and analog selection, which occurs in the context of the macrostructure for lyric stressing purposes. Metaphoric microvariation. The example here is Heimatlos, one of my original compositions. The highlighted microvariation occurs in between the A sections, which are the verses of the song. It is situated in the melodic repetition MR2. Including the pickup, this melodic repetition spreads over the last bar of each A section. In MR2-2, the second and third note of the melodic repetition have been altered.
From ist nun bloß von Ferne zu sehen, to sie folgen dem einst fremden Klang.
While the line moves downwards from F sharp to E in MR2-1, here both notes stagnate on D sharp, a non-continuous change which falls within the area of digital selection. Both iterations of MR2 happen over the chord D sharp half diminished. The composition is written in the key of C sharp minor. While D sharp half diminished is made up solely of notes which are natural to the key of C sharp minor, it has the most dissonant color of all chords natural to the key. In other words, it is the most foreign sound. The lyrics that the altered phrase is sung over are Sie folgen dem einst fremden Klang. They follow the once foreign sound. This is the second time that the D sharp half diminished chord appears in the composition. While the first time the sound might have been weird to the listener, in its second iteration it is not foreign anymore. The microvariation in MR2-2 lets the melody do exactly what the lyrics describe. The notes have been altered to the pitch of D sharp. D sharp is the root of the D sharp half diminished chord. Thus, the melody is, quite literally, following the once foreign sound. Therefore, this clearly is a metaphoric microvariation. Since it happens through the moment of the specific lyrics and chord, it occurs non-linearly. Overall, it is a nonlinear melodic microvariation of digital nature which occurs in the context of the macrostructure for metaphoric purposes.
Through this process of application, I applied a variety of microvariations to my compositions, which was a valuable experience. Now that you have seen how these microvariations are used in chart streaming hits as well as my own compositions, how about we look at what we can infer from all of the data that has been collected and analyzed? Let us delve into the discussion section.
All chart streaming compositions made use of a digitally organized macrostructure. In forms of repeated phrases, I came across melodic repetition, rhythmic repetition, and complete repetition. Here, complete repetition was the most common. Due to the fact that these sections are most predictable, surprise is more prominent as it breaks the listener's reassured expectations. In the context of the macrostructure and the microstructure, microvariation did occur in both of these contexts within most compositions. Thus, the occurrence of microvariation did not depend on the context of the magnitude of the structure, nor on the type of repetition in which it occurs. In terms of strands, melodic microvariation was by far the most prominent of all types of microvariating strands. This relates back to the fact that most repetitions in which microvariation occurred were complete repetitions. In terms of non-linearity, while occurring similarly as much, linear microvariation does tend to occur more often. Virtually all linear microvariations tended to be either conclusive or conceptual in purpose. This can be explained due to both of these purposes being connected to the overall lyrical or musical storyline of the whole song or a section respectively. Nonlinear microvariation tended to either stress a musical parameter of a moment or facilitate a transition from one section to another. Though overall most songs used a mixture of both. When placing microvariation on the spectrum from Mona to infinite set to analyze how non-continuous the change between the iterations of phrases was, almost all microvariations were either of digital or analog nature, both of which occurred similarly as often. As all songs contained both digital and analog microvariation, this combination might be a trend within the genre of popular music. Finally, throughout the analysis material, I found 9 different purposes of microvariation. Here, it is crucial to note that these are my own interpretations and that the purpose of the said microvariation can be self-defined by the listener. Additionally, it appears that the purpose of microvariations tend to relate to its linearity. A melodic conclusive microvariation concludes a section or piece and is thus connected to the general storyline of the piece and is hence linear. On the contrary, all transitional microvariations tend to occur at the moment of change between sections, harmonies, or time signatures and are thus nonlinear. However, one cannot conclude purpose to always relate to nonlinearity in this way without further research. Overall, there are limitless ways to classify and delineate microvariations using the presented 5-dimensional framework, especially because of purpose, which is defined more subjectively. Each dimension contributes to our understanding of the reasoning behind and the effect of microvariations and how we could use them.
Upon analyzing my own compositions, I found that I had already semi-consciously made use of microvariations as an emergent consequence of my composition process and style. Upon reflection, this could perhaps stem from my own personal proclivity to prefer variety in music, as I find it exciting. Another plausibility is that given that popular music is replete with microvariations and that I predominantly am influenced by and compose within this realm, I might be subconsciously using microvariations as a tool to better fit my music within the definition of popular music. Finally, in general, I compose to express emotion, and so each specific lyric might be enunciated through microvariation as a raw manifestation of emotions. After the analysis of pop music, I had access to a toolkit of microvariation that can be applied to my own compositions intentionally and creatively. By formalizing microvariations as a concept, I was able to have a higher level of precision in applying microvariations to my own composition. By being more conscious of microvariations, I was able to visualize the final effect I wanted to elicit from the audience and then accordingly apply a fitting one in different parts of my composition. The intentional application of microvariations also aided in sparking creativity by forcing me to experiment with new things and redefine my artistic boundaries. Within my highly repetitive songs, I was able to better strike a balance between repetitiveness and variation through the intentional utilization of microvariation. However, these insights come with their own caveats.
By limiting myself to microvariations in the melody line, I actively excluded other sound layers within the overall musical structure. This resulted in only finding microvariations for melody lines. Due to that, I cannot conclude anything about microvariation in other musical parameters such as harmony or groove. These would be projects that can be picked up by future researchers. Given that this research process is conducted by one person, the selection of microvariations may be biased to what I, the researcher, hear as microvariation. Repeating this process of coding songs for microvariations with more than one listener may have aided in finding more instances of microvariation due to the differing listeners' resolution and musical backgrounds, though this was not feasible given time and resource constraints. However, I would recommend for further research to include multiple listeners in the transcription process. Here it would be interesting to invite listeners with different levels of resolution to collect data on the precision with which different individuals perceive microvariation. Furthermore, a further extension to this thesis would be to perform my altered composition to further observe how listeners react to them and how they perceive it. A mixed methods analysis, such as a mixture of surveys and focus groups, would prove valuable in teasing apart trends in the perception and reception of microvariations in audiences of different ages, ethno-linguistics, backgrounds, and personal tastes. While this would be insightful, it makes for an entire thesis of its own and thus was not feasible within the current time frame. However, it would be the natural extension to this work if an opportunity presents itself. Finally, as harmony and groove amongst other musical parameters have not been investigated in this thesis, a future analysis could definitely consider taking them into account. This would result in a much more complex and specific classification scheme. Despite the above discussed limitations, this thesis and the framework that I have constructed still proves to be a promising tool for musicians, particularly composers and songwriters. The framework provides a foray into the realm of microvariations and becomes a platform that can spark discussion on their conscious creation and application.
The multitudes of microvariation and their differing purposes which were extracted from compositions throughout this research can be used in any musician's own compositions. Analyzing, classifying, and intentionally applying microvariations could prove valuable as a tool to enhance compositions, and this thesis sets an initial example. Further research is needed to explore the role of other musical parameters, as well as to repeat this procedure with a more extensive dataset. However, something valuable can be taken from this undertaking. Microvariations come in many shapes and sizes, and while the exact impact may differ, they ultimately still capture the listener's revering attention, allowing artists such as me to be able to wield
Thank you, Sebastian, and welcome back to the room here at Conservatorium Maastricht, where we will now go into the Q&A. Yes, I would like to turn first to your master research coach, Greg Torunsky.
Yeah, so nice presentation, well done. Was lots of fun, was great topic actually, what we picked up, and it turned to be really a complete thing. So I'm really happy about the effect. Maybe a question about this absolute surprise effect.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned this. Absolute surprise effect in song. Can you say a little bit more about this and name certain examples?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the absolute surprise hypothesis states that the surprise itself is what is activating the reward center in the brain, so that we are surprised that the brain is giving us dopamine, and then we are happy, and maybe we have preference towards the song. So yeah, the difference between the two is basically just that the first one sees surprise as a positive thing, while the contrastive surprise hypothesis sees surprise as a negative thing. So that the releasing of the tension back to the things that we know is what gives us dopamine. So basically the absolute surprise hypothesis is the one that sees surprise and the breaking of the schema within our minds as the positive thing.
And how about to relate this to the variation, to the repetition actually? Did you consider also like a key change or stuff like this? Would it be also?
Yeah, sure.
The measure?
Yes, the research itself, from the research paper that I've read, is actually, I think that was also in the name of the paper, looking into harmonic surprise. So basically what they did was that they took like 750 something chart streaming songs, and they debated them, they took them apart by quartile of where they placed within the Hot 100 charts. So, and then they compared the first quartile with the fourth quartile, the first quartile being like the highest streaming charts. And then they did like a lot of math stuff that I couldn't do myself personally, and did a whole data analysis about the chords of the first quartile versus the last quartile, and saw that in the first quartile there was more surprising chords. So within chords, like this research already has shown that people, depending on the context of course, because in pop music there is overall less chords than for example in jazz, do appreciate surprise to a certain extent.
Yeah. Cool, nice, thank you.
I have a question. First of all, thank you for the presentation, very impressive. As I understand, there's a lot of studio recordings you analyzed, right?
Yes.
So my question would be, what difference would the study have made between live concert and studio?
I think this question goes beyond live and studio, because it's also very depending on
Yeah, let me maybe I totally understand that live always is a different issue.
Yeah.
Because not everything can be planned.
Yes.
So a lot of stuff you correctly analyzed is very detailed, especially if you go in the studio.
Yes.
But live on stage, I would assume you would not. I mean, you would not get the different. Like you would not get the idea that there is a micro change in it.
Yeah.
But still, a lot of music. Our music comes from a live background. So so what effect does it probably make then if you try to analyze the live and try to take your studies to this live scenario?
Yes, I think it is still depending. The answer is still depending on the genre, because in pop music, I think a lot of things are through and through planned. Also the concerts themselves. I think when there's a setting where there's a more free way of like repeating sections and stuff like this, I think micro variations tend to occur within phrasing naturally. So I do think when analyzing live situations, it might actually be a very nice thing to do for further research, to see what, depending on the style and depending on the performances, what naturally occurs there, like if it's micro variations or if it's generally bigger variations. I think if you would listen to jazz, for example, I think it's quite typical to do bigger variations within the second form, for example, that I would often not qualify for micro variations. Whereas in pop, someone like, for example, Ariana Grande, if she sings like some small run in the second chorus or something that is maybe not part of the studio recording, maybe that would also qualify for micro variation. So I think this is actually a very good thing to look into in the future.
Yeah. Interesting. Maybe one more question. How did you come up with the other research papers? Like, what's your source? How did you find it? Because I was surprised that someone was diving into this in the 1950s. Yeah, I forgot his name. But that there were people like thinking about it like 50 years from now on, because this genre moved very much on. Yeah. So how did you find it? And
so it was actually most of the papers that I found were concentrating on repetition. It was quite difficult to find papers that actually specify and categorize variation itself. It usually was talking about repetition. And as repetition is one of the fundamentals of life, of music, it was quite easy to find different papers on repetition. What I found about variation was usually then maybe a bit sidelined, but did occur in these contexts to categorize repetition. So that's where I got some information from variation from. About microvariation, the only thing that I found about microvariation was someone talking about jazz, where they were talking about these very small things that they do while playing that people most likely wouldn't even recognize. But that wasn't really talking about active composition. That was more talking about the live situation. So basically, I was just looking through Google Scholar and finding with different keywords. I think I read about 20 papers and then noted it down to the ones that I actually really analyzed.
Thank you.
For me, maybe a bit of a different question regarding where you feel you've arrived and where you would like to go. Yeah. What are the burning questions that you're left with now at this point in time? So you've gotten through this whole pop genre and the tables that you've got out. What's next for you in terms of this research?
I intend to further research on this in the future. I will give myself a bit of a break now. I think the biggest thing that I would change is to have a much bigger data set. It is very difficult to transcribe this precisely, because when you look into microvariations, you really have to transcribe every single phrasing that you hear. Especially in pop music, where most of the things do tend to be very conscious choices. So I had a data set of 9 songs, which was enough to come up with the whole theory, but to get information on overall trends, you would need a much bigger data set. So that would be definitely something that I would do in the future. Of course, I would also like to go into the listener's resolution thing from Anne Danielsen. I think that is very interesting. That we all know that different people have different musical knowledge and that they perceive things differently. So to what extent does the general person even recognize microvariation, for example? That would be very interesting. And then of course also to extend it to other layers like harmony or groove and whatever. Of course, as a singer, my first choice was the melody line. But I think there's a lot of directions that it can still go to.
And I think as an artist, you are quite focused on remaining connected to pop as a genre, as a repertoire to focus on. I was wondering though at the same time if it might be an interesting concept to benefit from other genres in terms of research, not in terms of execution, but rather to see if other kinds of things surface there in this concept of melodic, still melodic, so not even going into other fields, but melodic micro variation. Have you considered that, or have you even found pieces that triggered these type of thoughts?
So I definitely consider it, because I still, even though my own music is a bit like pop with jazz influence, pop with 4-part harmony, I still consider myself also a jazz musician. So I was already thinking about how this could appear in jazz music, and I was thinking that even though the second repetition of the whole form might usually differ quite a bit in jazz music, there might be relatively simple forms generally. So I think in jazz music what I would hypothesize would be that microvariation might tend to occur less often on the macrostructure, so in between two sections, but maybe more likely in sequences within structures. That could be something that I could imagine could happen. In the paper from Middleton, he's also talking about different genres and how the macrostructure and the microstructure is to be placed on the spectrum from monad to infinite set. And while pop music mostly has like a relatively simple macrostructure with like the repeating chords, etc., then in comparison the microstructure and the melody line overall the whole song might vary more. Whereas with classical music, for example, often the macrostructure is often very different all throughout the song, like one line that goes on through the song, while then maybe the microstructure is less varying. So it's definitely also very interesting to see how this theory that I came up with could be implemented in different genres, yes.
Yeah. And also one kind of obvious question regarding other genres that would use this a lot would be minimal music. Have you considered, let's say, stealing from the concepts coming from minimal music?
Actually, now that you say that, I think that would definitely be something interesting to look into. I didn't think of that myself now, but yeah, I mean, it would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, because it's pretty much the concept.
Yeah. Well,
and there's the whole field of minimal music, like music, which is more film related, like call Amélie, for example, as a movie example that is not really minimal music because it's more romanticized, but it's still you stealing some of these concepts. Just some ideas for the future, maybe. Okay, thank you. Any questions in the room? Thoughts, moments? Yes.
Oh, there. You were first.
Marloes.
Did you notice any improvement in your songwriting after all the analyzations you did?
So the interesting thing is how I usually songwrite. I'm actually not a very theoretical musician. So I usually sit on the piano, I play chords, and then I improvise over it, record it, transcribe it. What this concept, what this theory helped me with is to give my composition for it to be overall more well-rounded. Because what I usually do is that I have this overall composition, and then I often just left it like that without further being more precise, right? With this, I now have one tool that I can use to I don't want to say make my music a bit more elaborate, but to pick and choose things that I see. For example, when I see a repetition and I'm like, oh, I don't really know how I want to change like the chorus from first to second part. And when I improvised, I just did the same thing. Now I have this to go back to it and implement it with the theory, small changes. Yes. Yeah? 9? Okay.
No? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sebastian. We will now go into a short recess, after which we will return for the final third presentation of the day at 5 o'clock. Bye.